There has been a ton of discourse surrounding the recent second official outing for Disney Plus's MCU TV adventures, Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Or, more accurately, Captain America and the Winter Soldier. Which, by the way, was anyone else annoyed that it didn't turn into Captain America and the White Wolf at the end of the show besides me? Oh, apparently the creator of the show thought so too. Anyways, while a lot of the discussions surrounding the show have centered upon race and America's history with blackness, as well it should given the show's focus on a black man taking up the mantle of Captain America, there's also been a secondary discourse going on around the show, mainly focusing in on the villains of the series, Karli Morgenthau and the Flag Smashers, and how they were handled in terms of representing actual radical revolutionary characters and movements. And in discussions of how the Flag Smashers have been framed by the show, most critics have focused in on two major talking points. The first has focused on how the Flag Smashers are just another in a long list of superhero antagonists being portrayed as having revolutionary leftist or anarchist values, and then being vilified for them. I mean, the MCU has actually done this several times before, with the Inhumans, for example, which, to be fair, is not a great show, but the villain of that show, Maximus, actually, it's been a minute since I watched that show, so let me quick check my notes. What was Maximus's plan? Was to overthrow the current ruling family regime that perpetuates an oppressive caste system and instead create a society based on social and economic equality. Why the f*** was he the villain again?
The days of Black Bolt's rigid meritocracy are coming to an end.
We can build it, all of us together, all of us equal.
God, that show was so bad. At least it had Anson Mount, which, only saving grace of that show, I can tell you. But the second argument, following a bit on the first one, argues that shows like The Falcon and the Winter Soldier are more interested in policing the tactics of revolutionary groups without actually offering up meaningful alternatives to the reasonable grievances against the current status quo that these groups have. Basically, these works focus on saying to the villain, bad villain, don't use violence, no, bad. Also, we're not going to address any of the problems that you had, but bad. Don't make me punch you, I will punch you, I will do it. Basically, the villain gets punched a lot, but the actual problems that they were kind of ranting about are still around at the end of the work, and everyone just seems to ignore it and go forward. So for today's video, I want to quickly analyze these tropes around revolutionary groups in superhero works, but I also want to push a little bit further. Because while I think both of these issues are present in a lot of superhero films and works, I actually feel that they aren't the real root cause of the problem. Because I think both of these issues are actually not deliberate intentions, but actually stem from a bigger misunderstanding and lack of imagination. That writers often are too afraid to look at or misunderstand why revolutionaries like those who would hold similar views to Karli and the Flag Smashers feel the need to be revolutionaries and commit violence in the first place. Now, before we get too much further into this discussion, I just want to make something really clear and explicit up front. I personally am a leftist, but my goal with this video, as I hope will be clear by the end of it, is not necessarily to just blanket condemn tropes and stereotypical portrayals of revolutionary groups that use violence, in order to say that I universally condone these methods just because they are something that I am sympathetic to. While I am sympathetic to them in a lot of cases, though not all, I also believe the use of violence is not something I always agree with or always disagree with, but understand it's always contextual based on every situation, and even within those contextual situations, it's always deserving of analysis and conversation, not complete and utter endorsement without actually looking what's going on. My goal here is just to analyze how these groups have been portrayed and possibly why they have been portrayed this way within superhero fiction. And by the way, I give this qualifier because I've seen a few other content creators address this exact subject around Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and people take that as them either condemning or condoning violence. And I'm not necessarily here to do either, especially within a fictional universe, which, is about having harder conversations in an imagined context. Because it's actually the point of these fictional universes and stories to have these nuanced conversations in a fictional context instead of a real world one, so we can work it out and actually analyze our values before it actually happens in the real world, or how we can apply it to the real world. So, With all that being said, let's take a look at the first criticism, that supervillains are often portrayed as holding leftist values in order to intentionally vilify those same values. I think one of the examples that most people bring up to argue this point is with Bane in The Dark Knight Rises. Bane is clearly a revolutionary figure and is also shown to at least espouse leftist ideals. But his ideals are shown to be so cartoonishly wrong-headed or evil as to vilify real-world talking points of the left-wing movements. At least that's what people argue about his portrayal. For example, Bane constantly references populist rhetoric, which is the framing of elites versus everyday people.
We take Gotham from the corrupt, the rich, the oppressors of generations who have kept you down with myths of opportunity, and we give it back to you.
Also within that movie, Catwoman, who is working for Bane at that point, whispers in Bruce's ear about how the 1% have taken everything from everyone.
You and your friends better batten down the hatches, because when it hits, you're all gonna wonder how you ever thought you could live so large and leave so little for the rest of us.
Which was a direct reference to the Occupy Wall Street movement that happened while this film was being made. The film even features trials of billionaires of Gotham, supposedly meant to hold them accountable for their corruption.
Who for years has been living off the blood and sweat of people less powerful than him.
Bane also literally attacks the stock exchange run by billionaires in this movie, which apparently is in Gotham now and has 0 guards in place to prevent a dude with a gun just completely tanking Bruce Wayne's fortune despite everyone knowing that it wasn't Bruce who did that, so it wouldn't possibly be legal in any way, shape, or form, but you know, comic book world, we'll just let it go. But also Bane is anti-capitalist in a lot of his sentiments.
I've paid you a small fortune.
This gives you power over me?
There's a lot that Bane espouses in this movie that I personally am sympathetic towards on an ideological level. But people argue that villains like Bane and Catwoman in this film are shown to just be plain evil for showing leftist values, and thereby equating leftist values with villainy. For example, Bane releases the prisoners of Blackgate, who he calls the oppressed, in order to fight for him.
But start by storming Blackgate and freeing the oppressed!
But instead of portraying these prisoners as actually oppressed people, like many leftists might argue in the real world that they might actually be, considering the many systemic issues that put people into jail, like over-policing and incarceration of lower-income and minority communities, in the movie, these prisoners are just shown to be mostly just violent murderers. And so Bane releasing these murderers onto the street is a very bad thing. The trials against the billionaires are just shown to be complete and utter farces, just ways for Cillian Murphy to chew the scenery.
Sold. The man in the cold sweat.
Which, you know, I'm not really complaining about. Any more Cillian Murphy is a good thing in my book. But Bane appears to be even more cartoonish by the fact that he just wants to blow up Gotham with a nuclear bomb just because. Even more so, the film even seemingly goes so far as to display a more conservative worldview as the heroic option. The film ends with Batman, a literal billionaire, showing up with literally every cop in Gotham to beat up everyday citizens and former prisoners in the streets in order to retake the city and reform the status quo. Which, given all of 2020 is like a yikes. And then a billionaire literally ends up saving everyone in Gotham by sacrificing his life to stop a nuclear bomb. Because billionaires really do care about us. That's the real trickle-down economics. The endless radiation fallout affecting Gotham citizens for years to come as they give thanks to the amazing Bruce Wayne who saved them all. Jokes aside though, this is a reading that many conservatives like to put onto the film. Someone like Ben Shapiro, for example, argued that he liked this film for that exact reason.
The entire movie is a diatribe about Marxism and the French Revolution. I mean, there's including a full trial scene, a mock trial scene. It's fantastic.
So yeah, the reading is definitely possible there. But I don't think this fully encapsulates the issue, because this interpretation of the film wasn't the intention of Christopher Nolan, who stated, quote,
"What was surprising to me is how many pundits would write about their political interpretation of the film and not understand that any one political interpretation necessarily involved ignoring huge chunks of the film."
And honestly, I kind of think he's right if you look at the film. Bane can be seen as simply leftist and just evil for it, but it also ignores the fact that Bane's goal wasn't really about stopping the corruption of Gotham and giving it back to the citizens like many revolutionary figures would actually want. His goal is actually in line with the League of Shadows, to show that all of Gotham, its billionaires yes, but also its average citizens, were just vile and not worth saving, and therefore needing to be completely obliterated in nuclear fire, because that follows.
Gotham, I will feed its people hope to poison their souls. I will let them believe that they can survive so that you can watch them clambering over each other to stay in the sun. You could watch me torture an entire city. And then when you have truly understood the depth of your failure, we will fulfill Razagul's destiny.
It's more accurate to say that Bane's use of populism mixed with anti-capitalist sentiments is actually more just a farce that he uses in order to get Gotham's people to fight each other, rather than something that he actually deep down believes.
It also ignores the fact that the movie ends with Bruce actually being influenced by some of Catwoman's arguments, realizing that he needs to open up the symbol of Batman away from his billionaire perspective and give it to an average citizen named Robin, who is also a cop. So yeah, there's that. But the point that I think the film was making was less that he was a cop who got to become Batman, and more that he wasn't a billionaire.
So in the end, the film is actually not completely saying leftism bad, but actually the hero characters of the film are actually influenced by the very rhetoric that Bane was espousing in some senses, even though Bane himself didn't actually believe it. The reason that his rhetoric was so effective was because he did have a point, and it influenced people like Bruce Wayne.
Grounds are left to the city of Gotham, that they shall be used for one purpose, and one purpose only: the housing and care of the city's at-risk and orphaned children.
So ultimately, in the end, The Dark Knight Rises uses the language of leftist movements, but really ultimately more in an ambiguous way, rather than actively trying to vilify leftist movements intentionally. And I think that this is often the case for many films like this. They use the trappings of leftist rhetoric to just be a background for their more personalized stories, like Bruce Wayne's evolution with his personal trauma. Take, for example, characters like Poison Ivy being an environmentalist. This isn't to necessarily say that environmentalism is bad, but what else are you going to have the crazy plant lady talk about in a movie like this?
Time has come for plants to take back the world so rightfully ours, because it's not nice to fool with Mother Nature.
She's got to have some sort of ideology, and filmmakers just say, yeah, I guess environmentalism kind of fits. But I think this starts to point to a larger issue that I'm going to be talking about later on in the video. Why do filmmakers like Christopher Nolan like to use the trappings of these political ideologies without actually wanting to address what they would actually mean within the worlds of their fictions?
But this brings us to the second issue that people have with leftist depictions of revolutionary groups in superhero films. That people focus on the tactics of these groups without actually providing solutions to the real grievances a villain may have. A good example of this can be found in Spider-Man: Homecoming. Batman, the Vulture. Dear God, Michael Keaton does love his aviary-centered super characters, doesn't he? But the Vulture, aka Adrian Toomes, was a salvager with a legitimate business, which went completely under because S.H.I.E.L.D., a powerful government agency, just showed up and unilaterally shut him down without giving him any recourse. And as a result, he was forced to become an arms dealer, not out of choice, but because it was a situation that he was put into against his will.
I have a city contract to salvage all this, okay, with the city.
I apologize, Mr. Toomes, but all salvage operations are now under our jurisdiction. Please turn over any and all exotic materials that you've collected, or you will be prosecuted.
Now, while this necessarily wouldn't play out in an arms dealer context for many revolutionary groups, this is very much an issue that many anarchist revolutionaries might point to as evidence of a society that fails to care about its working class and forcing them into morally questionable activities out of necessity, and then vilifying them as a result, without actually offering them other options to do other things to survive. And the film kind of follows on this exact point. It never actually resolves or addresses this situation in any real way. Toomes instead is just shown to be the bad guy because he's an arms dealer, with the film just wanting to say, hey, don't do that, that's bad. Moralizing at the villain that they are performing villainous acts without offering an alternative solution to them for the situation that they had no way out of. Something they were often forced into by the very same people moralizing at them. And while this is a high-stakes situation and somewhat muddy in terms of its depiction given that there's arms dealing involved, this is a real issue that we see played out in real-life politics today, both in large and small scale. For example, the United States actively stigmatizes those in poverty, shaming them for being poor. There's so much rhetoric in the United States about people being poor because they're lazy, because they don't get off their butts, because they're not working hard enough. But there are so many systems in the US that actively keep the poor in poverty no matter how hard they work, and in fact forces them to work harder even though they can't get out of poverty. And this is something I did a whole video on that I recommend you check out. It'll be up here somewhere. But a quick example, just for this video to show you what I mean, is, for example, how lower income communities are over-policed, pushing them into the criminal justice system, which then forces them to pay regular and often inordinate fees and fines, preventing them from making more money to get themselves out of poverty, and thereby forcing them to again go into criminal acts. It's a vicious cycle, and one which the overriding message of society to the poorest say to them that they should work harder, push harder, and just tells them that they shouldn't be criminals. Despite the fact that they become criminals because they need to pay the bills, because they want to push harder, because they want to work harder, but they can't. In movies like Spider-Man Homecoming, they bring up important issues to create understandable motivations for their villains, but don't bother to address those motivations really by the end of the film. These motivations and backdrops are just used to get a villain that we relate to, and then get to the punchy punch fight with our hero. But as a result, the film fails to acknowledge why these issues would make us relate to the villain in the first place. Why do we relate to Toombs' struggle as a working class man who was sort of forced into a horrific situation? The film never really acknowledges it, it just uses us to relate to him. But why are we relating to him? That's the real question that the film doesn't really want to address. So, with both of these tropes, the issue I think that many critics get into is ascribing these tropes as the sole issue in and of themselves. But in actuality, I think they're actually evidence of a larger problem with superhero media and many blockbuster films today. The desire, perhaps intentional or not, to uphold a larger societal status quo rather than fundamentally questioning or changing it. Something that revolutionary groups inherently ask in what they're seeking. And I think the Flag Smashers as characters in Falcon and the Winter Soldier highlight this issue because for the first time, or at least one of the few times, while they do highlight the tropes that we've been talking about, the show actually also pushes against them. Yet despite this, the show still feels off in how it presents the Flag Smashers' actual agenda. Within the fiction of the show, the goal of the Flag Smashers is, while somewhat nebulous within the MCU, actually very relatable and understandable. After the Thanos snap eliminated 50% of the universe's population, we learned that it was a period of trauma on Earth, yes, but also of relative harmony, with borders being removed and torn down and people coming together.
For 5 years, people have been welcomed into countries that have kept them out using barbed wire. There were houses and jobs. Folks were happy to have people around to help them rebuild. It wasn't just one community coming together, it was the entire world coming together.
Following the blip, with half of the world's population suddenly coming back out of nowhere, the world went back to being more border-focused, separating off people, and leaving the newly displaced people who came back in a new world without being able to get back to their original countries or without an actual citizenship.
And then boom, just like that, it goes right back to the way it used to be.
While the GRC was set up to help this, they held back resources and distributed them and people badly.
The Global Repatriation Council promised to send more teachers, supplies. That was 6 months ago.
Forcing people to become refugees and deal with homelessness and terrible conditions as a result. Thus, Carly formed the Flag Smashers, a group created with the goal of trying to unify the world back to being one without borders.
Essentially, these people, they want a world that's unified without borders. So you can see why a lot of people are into that.
As they constantly say,
one world.
One people.
One people.
One people.
Their goal isn't to fight for any government or hierarchical structure, in fact, actively against those things. They just want to allow people to just exist and for resources to be distributed fairly across the world to people who actually need them most.
How many times do we have to pay with our lives just to be citizens of this goddamn planet?
And this is an admirable goal for anyone. And it comes out of an understandable frustration for a system that seemingly doesn't care for her or the plight of many displaced refugees. And this comes out of a very real problem in our world today. If you want a direct analysis of similar real-world violence caused by the simple existence of borders, I'd recommend this video by Renegade Cut. But let's hone in on the way that the Flag Smashers are presented even though they have these admirable goals, because the tropes that we've been talking about are present, but also subverted. Like Bane, for example, Carly is regularly portrayed as being overly villainous. For example, in episode 3, Carly assaults a GCR base to get resources for refugees that the GCR was just sitting on. There was a clear goal and clear intention, and something that is understandable for her to want to do, even if we don't necessarily agree with her violent tactics of breaking in and taking it against government will. I would agree that even though the government says that these resources need to stay here, if there are people who need these resources who would more directly benefit of them, we should give them to those people instead of hoarding them for the powerful. But at the end of this assault of the GCR base, Carly just decides to simply blow up the base, killing everyone inside of it, because...
This is is the only language these people understand.
It's very unclear what her direct goal was with blowing up that facility.
In fact, the show goes out of its way to show how horrible this action was by Carly, stating that Carly killed a father of 2 in this act.
One of the workers killed was the father of 2, and had only been on the job for 1 week.
In fact, we end up learning that her blowing up the base was actually harmful to her cause. Her violence actually forced the GCR to push up their vote to relocate refugees against their will.
After condemning this latest action by the radical group known as the Flag Smashers, the GRC formally began drafting legislation known as the Patch Act, which would seek to restore traditional border regulations and fast-track the return to normalcy.
Later on, a similar thing happens. When she takes GCR senators hostage, she proclaims that they're going to kill the senators and become martyrs if anything bad happens.
Worst case scenario, we kill the hostages. We're supposed to use them to negotiate.
But why? What would the indiscriminate murder of senators get her? Wouldn't it just ostracize people from her cause? It would actually directly harm what her real intentions were. And this is the issue. She has no real intentions with this violence. She just wants to commit violence for violence sakes. It's that show using the trope to make her appear overly villainous and the bad guy and worth being defeated in the end. But I also should be clear, I'm not saying that revolutionaries don't commit violence like this. They do. For example, we could look at the troubles in Northern Ireland between the 1960s and 90s, where revolutionary groups like the IRA used violence in order to try to make controlling Northern Ireland so costly for the United Kingdom that they would eventually give it back to Irish control. Now, obviously this is more complex than that, and I'm not necessarily moralizing on whether the IRA was right or not in their use of violence. Again, that's not the point of the argument here that I'm making. The point that I am making, though, is to point out that there are revolutionaries in similar situations as Carly who do use violence like she did. But it's often wielded with much more intention. But here, Carly seems solely motivated on whim and ego, not listening to her fellow flag smashers or even notifying them beforehand of her intention to use violence, just doing it on a whim. But the show starts to subvert this and make this more interesting and actually show the nuance of this. It's a problem that Carly has, not the flag smashers. Her fellow flag smashers are visibly bothered by her actions numerous times. Do I wish the show had allowed them more time to verbalize this and actually present it more noticeably within the show? For sure. But it is definitely there and shown that she is just doing this on her own and not necessarily is part of the goals of the overall flag smashers. And this also does happen in revolutionary groups. Revolutionary groups do have people within them that just want to get revenge against a system that has actually harmed them instead of necessarily always thinking about the political goal of every single one of their acts of violence. And the show acknowledges this by showing that it's not her views that are villainous. In fact, the show actually takes heavy pains to show that her views are understandable. She, individually, is made to seem villainous. Even more so, Sam Wilson, Captain America himself, actually is shown to agree with her viewpoints at several points. He even says this:
I'm not your enemy. I agree with your fight. I just can't get with the way you're fighting it.
Which brings us to that second trope. The show does question Carly and the Flag Smashers' tactics. Sam directly questioned how she views the world and how she wields violence and rhetoric against her enemies. But instead of leaving it there, instead of just saying, oh, don't do this, that your tactics are wrong, the show does offer up an alternative in the form of Sam's final speech to the senators of the GCR, after Carly is killed.
Do you think it is fair for governments to have to support them?
Yes.
In this speech, Sam is actually offering up an alternative to Carly's violent tactics. But we'll get to what that alternative is in a second. But within this, both of the tropes that we were talking about earlier were subverted within Falcon of the Winter Soldier. Carly is portrayed as an overly villainous revolutionary, but it's presented as an individual issue with her, not her views. Similarly, the show does critique her tactics, but it does offer up an alternative. But there's still an issue here in terms of how the Flag Smashers are presented within the show, and it's actually most obvious in Sam's speech at the end. Now, let me be upfront here, do not get me wrong, I really love this speech and I praised it in my actual review of the episode. I think it's one of the most political rebukes that the MCU has ever done. For me personally, and again, I would recommend that you listen to people from the Black community about this rather than me, but for me personally, I found that Sam deciding to take up the mantle of Captain America, wearing the iconography of a country that has systemically oppressed him and the Black community for hundreds of years, was decently well handled. In his speech, he didn't necessarily say that him becoming Captain America was the 100% right choice. He just said that the country wasn't ready for him to be Captain America, something that was true. And yet, he was going to do it anyways because it might mean something to those who came next, to the kids of the next generation. But that some people might be offended by that choice, and it's understandable if they were.
Even now, here,
I feel it. The stares, the judgment. And there's nothing I can do to change it. Yet I'm still here.
That there wasn't a right or wrong here in this situation. Something that Isaiah Bradley ends up representing. And I actually like that Bradley ends up not agreeing with Sam in the end.
We built this country. Bled for it. I'm not gonna let anybody tell me I can't fight for it. Not after what everybody before me went through.
Shit. I almost bought that.
Now, I do have some issues with how Isaiah Bradley is framed in the entirety of the show, but that part, for my money, was good. And if you want to get into some of the criticisms of Isaiah Bradley and how this show frames race within the show, I'd highly recommend this video up there if you want to click that. It's not by me, it's by Feminist Frequency, and I think they do a good job of analyzing some of the issues with how race is presented within the show as a whole. But on this front, Sam making the choice to become Captain America is done well because he's acknowledging that it's not going to please everyone. But this is a way to move forward in some way that might be positive and constructive. Maybe not for everyone, but in some way. And this can at least start that process, however flawed it may be, both within the universe of the MCU and our real world too, with how we acknowledge and accept a black Captain America. A black man representing a symbol of a country that has systemically harmed him. It's complicated, and the show and Sam and we can acknowledge this. But this same understandability isn't necessarily present when dealing with the Flag Smashers. Instead of acknowledging the complexity of the situation, Sam does present a direct alternative to the Senators.
People believed in her cause so much that they helped her defy the strongest governments in the world. Why do you think that is? Look, you people have just as much power as an insane god or a misguided teenager. The question you have to ask yourself is, how are you going to use it?
Sam basically says that this issue is the personal fault of the Senators for not having people like Carly in the room when they make their vote to relocate people, to not necessarily look at the conditions of these people.
Who's in the room with you when you're making those decisions? Is it the people you're going to impact? Or is it just more people like you?
And that is 100% true. The Senators not having folks in the room of groups that they're relocating as part of the discussion is a huge problem. They don't actually seem to care about the people that they're relocating. And while it is nice to tell the Senators to
do better, Senator,
it still doesn't address the entire issue. Because the issue wasn't just the vote or that refugees didn't have a say.
Control the banks. Shit, you can move borders. You can knock down a forest with the email. You can feed 1 million people with the phone call. But the question is, who's in the room with you when you're making those decisions?
No, sadly, Sam, that's not the question. The question is why they have that power in the first place.
Why do they get to make decisions in the United States for people all around the world? It's not a personal problem. It's a systemic problem that allocated resources and power not to the refugees or the people who needed it, but to those who already had power, who were born within borders that were richer and deemed more worthy. The system wasn't about helping everyone, but giving a power to the few to have power over more people. As Honest Trailers even pointed out,
one who will call out the problems with our system.
Look, you people have just as much power as an insane god.
Then ask them to do better and hope that it changes anything.
You've got to do better, Senator.
Honestly, the fact that this speech works is the least realistic part of the MCU.
At the end of the day, the show seems to make it seem like Sam's speech actually would fix the problems that the Flag Smashers are dealing with. But in actuality, his speech wouldn't really fix all those problems. And you know why I know this? Is because the show almost kind of gets to the point of acknowledging this as well. Because even though Carly gets killed, the rest of the Flag Smashers continue to live for a short while after, and are clearly shown to be interested in continuing the fight.
One world, one people.
Clearly not with the same tactics as Carly, because they were shown to be against them at numerous points within the show, but they do still wish to fight against the GRC. And it's also shown that the Flag Smashers clearly have worldwide support, not just within their organization, but from everyday citizens. This is an issue that is going to be a problem moving forward for everybody, that everyone has a stake in the world. But to have the Flag Smashers continue within the show would have to mean that acknowledging that the solutions as presented in Sam's rebuke to the Senators would not have solved all the problems. That this is a complex geopolitical fight that was going to continue regardless, because the issue was complex and wasn't going to be fixed with a single speech. It wasn't about a few bad apples or an outside force that caused the problem, but a systemic problem born within how the world is set up currently and will continue to exist. In actuality, what most likely would happen in the MCU after this point would at the very least be a long-term worldwide political conversation, possibly even a worldwide conflict, possibly even a global war, all based around this single issue. And that sort of discussion has the potential to completely change the entire political makeup of the MCU. It would mean acknowledging that the Flag Smashers and the people they fight for are being systemically harmed and will continue to be systemically harmed, and that they will probably try to push against it in some way, shape, or form, whether that be with just politics or potentially violence if they weren't being listened to, which it sounds like they probably wouldn't be. Again, that's not me condemning or condoning, this is just what would happen in this type of situation. But the MCU as a series can't have this complicated controversy continue on into the future of the franchise, where things like borders and nations like the United States need to be upheld, a status quo and system to perpetuate in order to continually make movies that are recognizable. And so in order to sort of forget about this issue, all the Flag Smashers are just conveniently killed. A complex issue reduced to nothing and ignored so that the status quo can be upheld within the MCU. And so this, I think, leads us to the real crux of the issue when it comes to how revolutionary groups are presented in superhero and many other blockbuster media. The intention isn't to vilify leftist groups or show revolutionaries to be tactically wrong. The real problem is the inability to really reckon with what it means that revolutionary groups actually exist within these systems. It means acknowledging that their grievances are real, and that they are continuing even at the end of the film. And it would mean acknowledging that the status quo of many of society's elements, from capitalism to borders to many other things, are causing everyday and continued harm. And that people would want to push back against that. And films do ignore this in a bunch of different ways. With films like The Dark Knight Rises, the film becomes overly interpretive and isn't really focused on the politics at all. Rather, it's using the trappings of politics to tell a more personal story of Bruce Wayne overcoming his psychological trauma.
But while the film is just using the political trappings of leftist movements, it still refuses to place the burden of the blame on a system, but instead on individuals. In that film, the problem with Gotham's elitism was shown to be the problem of a few billionaires like Bruce Wayne and this guy, as well as Commissioner Gordon.
I hope you have a friend like I did, to plunge their hands into the filth, so that you can keep yours clean.
Your hands look plenty filthy to me, Commissioner.
But not actually the fault of any system within Gotham itself, but just a few bad apples. It doesn't ask the question, for example, of what the police's role as an organization is within the structures of Gotham that keep people going into the criminal system. It's the exact same type of ideology that causes people to say that the poor are poor because they're lazy. We see it as an individual problem, not a systemic one, with the understanding that the poor are poor because there are numerous systems in place that keep them there. And Falcon and the Winter Soldier ends up doing this too. It frames both Carly and corporations as equally responsible, despite the obvious power imbalance between Carly and corporations and people in power that the show actively acknowledges.
You're a supremacist.
Me?
Yeah?
That's ridiculous. Everything I do is to end supremacy. These corporations and the beasts who run them, they're the supremacists.
So? You're killing innocent people.
They're not innocent. They're roadblocks in my journey, and I'd kill them again if I had to.
Wow.
Similarly though, in films like Spider-Man Homecoming, when we look at villains like Toomes, even though he is portrayed as villainous and his motivations are clearly influenced by problems with society that cause him to want to act out against it, he is not portrayed as one of the most villainous type of villains within the MCU. In fact, he is often cited as one of the most relatable villains within the entire franchise. So much so that there's a point in the film where Spider-Man and Toomes actually relate to each other because they share a common struggle.
You and me? They don't care about us. We build their roads and we fight all their wars and everything. They don't care about us. We have to pick up after them. We have to eat their table scraps. That's how it is. I know you know what I'm talking about, Peter.
And so too, similarly, for Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
Don't condescend to me, I'm not a child.
I'm not condescending. I know what it feels like to lose someone, believe me.
But in Spider-Man Homecoming, the film actively ignores the reason why Toomes fell into this in the first place, to just use it to make him relatable without actually doing any work to really acknowledge what made him relatable in the first place. Because we understand that the system is screwing him over. And many of us have felt that to some degree or another. That's what makes him a relatable villain. But Falcon and the Winter Soldier stands in direct opposition to this because it does ask the question, why are people sympathetic to Carly?
This girl died trying to stop you. And no one has stopped for 1 second to ask why.
But does Sam acknowledge that it's a system's fault?
You've got to do better, Senator.
No, instead he throws it as an individual fault of the senators. And by placing it on individuals rather than a system, the show actually doesn't wrestle with what the world could actually look like if Sam and the world of the MCU actually tried to change things on a systemic level.
Because it would require a radical addressing of the status quo within the MCU, to actually deal with it on a literal level, and actually change what society means within the MCU. Again, I am not saying the Flag Smashers were 100% right or justified in their violence in all cases. Revolutionary groups are also human, and as such, people like Carly exist. And yes, maybe the Flag Smashers' goals are idealistic or not realistic. There's a lot to critique there. What I am saying is that revolutionary groups often resort to violence because they have very real reasons to fight a system that harms them, and have no other alternatives as a result. But our media and Western culture often opts to ignore that. It fails to actually engage with what they're actually advocating for and pushing against. And while this may not be the intention, instead of actually wrestling with these issues, media instead either cartoonishly vilifies these groups, or leaves their reasons nebulous enough to be open to interpretation as possibly bad, or doesn't address it at all. Or, in the case of Falcon and the Winter Soldier, they try to say that, oh yeah, these people had a real grievance, but it's these individuals' fault rather than actually a system's fault that has been put in place that allowed those individuals to have power in the first place.
But in every single case in these films
never look at these problems, look at the system, and say, this isn't good enough. It reminds me of how people like to remember someone like Martin Luther King as this sanitized figure who apparently showed up one day to just say racism is bad, but what that does is it actually ignores all the actual revolutionary things that Martin Luther King fought for. For example, King literally said,
"We must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see how that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life must be changed. America is a hypocritical nation, and we must put our own house in order."
But today, we are taught in middle school that the world that we have today is the world that King dreamed of. That we achieved King's goals, and that racism is over, and racism is done. But in actuality, the world King dreamed of is one that even our movies and TV shows, which are supposed to visualize our dreams, are still too scared to even show or hint at. What frustrates me most is that the MCU actually had a chance to show this directly because it depicted a revolutionary group even better earlier on. In Black Panther, Killmonger is a revolutionary figure, a man who fights for a radical change in the status quo of the entire world, and wants to redistribute the wealth and weapons of Wakanda to black communities.
You know where I'm from. When black folks started revolutions, they never had the firepower or the resources to fight their oppressors. Where was Wakanda?
Again, I'm not condoning his actions or violent tactics, and those tactics are definitely criticized by the movie itself, and they are stopped by T'Challa. But the movie doesn't ignore Killmonger's overall criticisms or dehumanize him. In fact, Killmonger gets the most humanization in the film of all the characters, and T'Challa is actually moved by his actions in the end. So much so that T'Challa is actually willing to radically change how Wakanda works, and the entire world as a result, by sending Wakandan aid and money to black neighborhoods around the world. Yet, at least as of this moment, we don't really see the aftermath of that. That seems like something that would naturally come up within Falcon and the Winter Soldier, given that we see many black communities within the show as well as Wakanda appearing within the narrative. But instead the show doesn't really acknowledge that that happened earlier in the MCU. What would it mean that Wakanda, one of the richest nations in the world, was putting money into black communities around the world, particularly underfunded communities around the world? What would it mean to envision within one of the world's biggest fictional franchises, the MCU, not just a fictional Afrofuturistic country, but an actual Afrofuturistic Brooklyn, a place where black kids could actually grow up in an entirely restructured America that redistributed power back to black communities, something that Martin Luther King articulated as his desire. I don't know if the MCU is going to do that. Maybe in Wakanda Forever we'll see it, fingers crossed. But as of right now, we're not actually seeing that fallout of what it would mean to change these systems. But at the very least, Black Panther as a movie acknowledged the complexities of the situation, that it wasn't a perfect one person was right, one person was wrong, and that the solution requires that we actually would have to radically change society, or at least talk about it, even if we don't actually see that change as it might have naturally occurred within the MCU given what happened at the end of Black Panther.
At the end of the day, I will give Falcon and the Winter Soldier some credit for going further than most, but it still does not go far enough.
And there are many reasons that this sort of depiction or lack of follow-through might occur. Some of it may be just because these are shows made by mega corporations like Disney, who aren't really interested in fundamentally questioning a status quo of society, but just selling movie tickets. But I also think it's a failure of our collected imaginations. It's a failure to imagine within our most popular fictions our biggest concerns, our biggest conversations, our biggest struggles, and also our biggest possibilities. We should start to demand from all of our blockbuster media that we want stuff like this addressed. Not necessarily to say that groups like the Flag Smashers are 100% right or wrong, but also not to ignore or vilify them or point to individuals as the solution to our problems, but actually say that, yeah, it's complicated and the system isn't working for many, and perhaps we need to begin to actually acknowledge that and deal with it, and ask the question, what does that mean if we acknowledge it and try to deal with it? Because if we can't even do that in our fiction, how can we even begin to imagine it's possible to do in real life? Alrighty everybody, that is it for this video. Whew. This thing is heavy to hold for that entire time, but it is awesome. You know, as should be clear, you know, I am criticizing the show, but I did really love it. I did think there were a lot of good things within it, and I want to just make clear that this is also just my opinion and one problem that I have with the show that I've also just seen extrapolated across a lot of media. It's not just a problem within this show or the only thing that I saw within the show, but this is something that I see as a bigger trend in a lack of imagination within our media. And something that I think we need to address if we're going to have shows that address what it means to use symbols like this within shows and iconography and superheroes and people that we look up to. I think it's important that we have these conversations. And again, I'm not here to condone or condemn, I'm just here to say this is a conversation that we should have and that our fiction should allow us to have in a safe context and enable the conversation. Because that's what fiction's about, to enable these conversations in ways that might not allow us to have in real life because of how heated or emotional it gets. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this creates that conversation, and I would love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. So, let's just start that conversation off down there. But beyond that, don't forget that I also have a Patreon where you can support me. I also have a second channel called Jessie Gender After Dark, where I do all my individual reviews and geek out and dorky stuff that isn't necessarily always tied to these bigger video essays. So go check out that channel as well. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel to get more video essays that come out each and every Friday like this. But beyond all of that, I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper.
I didn't start the Patreon, okay I did, but I didn't light it cause you all provided, so thank you to patrons. I'm gonna sing the list now and I hope you like it. Alexander Miller, Catherine Lambath, Miranda Janelle, Ashley Allen Bokikio, Eli Bermas, Sonia J. Taffer, Ashlyn Solstice, Greg Gillum, Stephen Clenard, Randy Thompson, Baba Ruski, Felicia Toast, Alexander Miller, Stephen Schuhart, Kate McTeekeen, Wellington Marcus, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl Bass, James Krivda, Ish the Man, A Man Chooses, A Slave Obeys, John Cool, Dominic Noble, Buttoneer, Wu-Tan Fool, Jessica Wright, Peter Landers, Travis Ridge, John Steele, Meadow Whisperer, William Stewart, Joy A, Maggie the Goblin, Camille T, Ulysses the Pagan, Amanda Comet, Alex Owen, Jason Knott, Munir Amlani, BBD, Hannah F, John Weatherby, Hirius, Maeve Lamia, Nathan Steele, Bree Breacher, Andrew K, Sky Skinner, Sean Piper, Flynn, Tiffany Danger, Bush, Wendizzle Bizzle, Gretchen Badger, Geek Filter, Cass the Lass, Janie Packard, Ellie O'Dare, Keith Briggs, Troy Stull, Sarah Bystam, Mari Neckar, Laura Demereau, W. Randy Edie, Lysa, Polly Mina Din, Pissed and Twisted Garage, Jacob Tovar, Sarah Sweeney, Jessica Chapman, Nikki Gordon Bloomfield, Mara Mack, Andrew Lamoureux, Celestial Dawn, Zone 1 Librarian, Jenny Marble, Michael Hardy, Pasty, Corey, and Vale Honkanen. Newt says hi to everybody, and we love you. Mwah.